Tonight we're blessed, privileged to have Richard Sonnenfeldt in our midst. A little bit of background. About 2.5 years ago, I had the privilege of going out to Port Washington, New York, where our Elizabeth Linnae Fellow, John Barrett, lives. It's a long story, but I won't tie it together, but Richard Sonnenfeldt lives in the same town as Professor John Barrett. So through that connection, I had a chance to catch up with Richard Sonnenfeldt, to interview Richard Sonnenfeldt, and to get the story about his life. And I was thrilled, absolutely thrilled that I had found a nugget. As a result of that, we started a relationship which led to Dick having a vision about what could be done at the Robert Jackson Center and what could be done in order to advance this concept of international law and the legacy of Robert Jackson. He doesn't remember writing this letter, but let me do a few excerpts here. I am writing this letter as a catalyst, hoping to enlist your interest and support for an idea that has already gathered important acceptance in America and Germany. May 8th, 2005 will be the 60th anniversary of VE Day. October 20th and November 20th will be the 60th anniversaries of the serving of the indictments on the Nazi defendants at the Nuremberg trials and the actual start of the trials, respectively. While the various Holocaust centers and museums do an admirable job in remembering and honoring the victims of Hitler, less is done to expose the perpetrators of the horrible crimes that were committed after they conquered Germany before they could attempt to conquer the world to exterminate their foes. Perhaps there's been a reluctance to expose the causes and the organizations of the Holocaust for fear of seeming to whitewash the results. But understanding the causes and what motivated the perpetrators is central to preventing a repetition. There's much material available that has not been widely aired. Central to these considerations are the Nuremberg trials, which unearthed who did what to bring about the deliberate and total destruction of the democratic constitution of Germany by the Nazis and their lawless behavior achieved without revolution or armed rebellion. Those trials then and now are still the only and at least the best attempts to create and apply world law broadly to crimes against peace, crimes against humanity, war crimes, etc. Robert H. Jackson was central to those trials. I believe the key to create a program that is different from those Holocaust and VE Day events that have become all too common. We should honor Robert Jackson as a warrior for world law, remember all the significant events of 60 and 70 years ago, and stress common German-American concerns for human rights and remaining issues, for instance, in international law. He concluded this letter by saying, I can only acquaint you with an idea that has enormous appeal to me and hope that someone steps up to convert it into a program. So with that charge, we had the opportunity to talk to Dennis Hefner, to Richard Jankowski, the folks at SUNY Fredonia, Chautauqua Institution, to develop a program which is where we are here today. We can't thank you enough, Dick, that your inspiration and encouragement at the get-go is what really led to us having this conference here, and for that, you deserve a round of applause. So it's appropriate that I really do have a chance to quickly introduce our speaker tonight. It'll be very brief because the man you want to hear is Richard Sonnenfeldt. He was born in 1923 in Berlin. He grew up in a small village northeast of Berlin in what post-war became East Germany, but he lived there as a young German Jew in the 20s and into the 30s as the circumstances of his whole world changed. His parents, both physicians, over time, as a function of the Nuremberg Laws, were prohibited from practicing their profession. Their economic circumstances and their physical safety began to deteriorate, and as so many parents work to do in those circumstances, they looked at the most precious things in their lives, their 2 young sons, and figured out in time a way to get the sons out of Germany. As a teenager, Richard Sonnenfeldt and his younger brother Helmut became boarding students in a school in Kent, England. And Richard Sonnenfeldt was there when Germany went to war against England in the late 1930s. At that point, he was a German in England. In other words, an enemy alien, and thus he was interred by the United Kingdom. As an enemy alien and a suspect foreign national, he was put in transport capacity and shipped to Australia. From Australia, he sort of talked his way into a visa, and by the way, his parents independently and miraculously had succeeded in getting from Germany to, I believe, Switzerland, to Baltimore, and survived, and themselves got out. And that fact allowed Richard Sonnenfeldt to negotiate his way out of prisoner status and into a visa applicant status because he had people in Baltimore and they had American sponsors. A long journey, and it's in a book, if you can read German, all here. All of which is a sojourn of a boy who is not yet 20 years old. Somebody whose education stopped at the 10th grade when all these travails and travels began. Richard Sonnenfeldt came of age and briefly began studies in America, but registered with the Selective Service, and his number was called, and he had become an American citizen. In that meantime, he'd become an American soldier. And he was in France, and he fought with the U.S. Army in 1945 and in 1944 and into 1945. And as the war came to an end in the spring of 1945, he became a worker in a motor pool. And he became, during 1945 and 46 year, the chief American interpreter for the American prosecution in Nuremberg, Germany. Richard Sonnenfeldt is one of the only people in that time period who literally played a role in questioning, as an interrogator/interpreter, the 22 principal Nazis who became defendants in the international military trial. Recall Goering, Hess, Ribbentrop, Rosenberg, the who's who. There's one guy right here who had an opportunity to be up close and personal with all of them. His life story continues, as some of it is in the program which you all received today. But what he's going to talk about us today is that experience, those people, and the perspective it has given him and the life he led since, and what it connects in today's issues. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm delighted, absolutely delighted, that the kickoff speaker for this conference is a guy who conceived it more than 18 months ago and is here today, Richard Sonnenfeldt.
And Dr. Hafner, it gives me the chance to greet you again. I don't see Mr. Sullivan, who is from the Tocharka Institute and one of the sponsors of this conference. And I have the great honor to be the first and lead speaker. And I want to tell you that I was very embarrassed when I appeared here and didn't wear a tie, because my nurse forgot to pack my tie. But since then, I've spotted at least one other gentleman without a tie, and I thank you for saving me from great embarrassment.
We have another.
A hand to that gentleman. I'm honored to be here and speak about my experiences in Nuremberg. In the Nuremberg trials, exactly 60 years ago in November. That was the first time that officers of a sovereign nation were tried and punished for war crimes by an international tribunal. Robert Jackson, the chief American prosecutor and a prime organizer of the trials, insisted that the Nazis be given a fair hearing. He wanted to advance world law. But he also said in his opening remarks, no history of this era can be entitled to authority which fails to take into account the record of Nuremberg. You will hear from distinguished jurists about the legal framework of the trials and where world law stands today. But I tonight will talk about what I learned about a few of the men who made the Nazi history. I lived from the beginning of that history in the street fights of Germany to its end at Nuremberg. By then, Hitler and the trio of Himmler, Goebbels, and Bormann, who had ruled Germany under him from 1940 to the end, when the worst crimes were committed, had convicted themselves by suicide. Now only Hermann Goering and Rudolf Hess were left from among the principal Nazis. And Hess had flown to England before the Holocaust, and he was now in a questionable mental state. And the rest of the defendants had served Hitler as accomplices, carrying out his criminal orders, but they were not principals. I was born in 1923 as Heinz Wolfgang Richard Sonnenfeldt into a Jewish family in Germany whose ancestors were German citizens when the year 1800 was rung in. My father had been an officer in the Kaiser's army in World War I, and he kept his uniform pressed, ready to wear again. I grew up in the country town of Gardelegen as a German boy and learned that we were Jewish only when I asked my parents why I was circumcised. Religion played absolutely no role in my early childhood. As a child, I lived in a world where those that governed Germany after the Kaiser were blamed by the Nazis and their right-wing allies for the miseries that followed Germany's capitulation after World War I. Germans still believed in obeying authority, once summarized by the last imperial chancellor like this: the prime duty of every citizen, he should have said subject, is obedience to the state, that meaning the Kaiser. And as I grew to school age, the Kaiser was gone, but the habit of obedience was not. By 1932, the Nazis had about 35% of the vote. And on January the 30th, 1933, Hitler was appointed prime minister of a minority government with only 2 Nazi ministers. And one of those was Hermann Goering, now our prisoner at Nuremberg. But he controlled the police. And he was also the Speaker of the Reichstag, the German parliament. Just 3 weeks later, fire was set to the empty Reichstag building, which the Nazis blamed on a Bolshevik uprising. And Goering now persuaded the non-executive President Hindenburg to grant Hitler emergency powers permitted by the German Constitution. It was in fact a self-destruct clause. Goering then deputized 70,000 stormtroopers, SA men, as auxiliary policemen to arrest Nazi opponents. And next, he had a rump parliament confer unrestricted powers on Hitler. Goering was now clearly the number 2 Nazi, and not long thereafter he was put in charge of the economy. And as the unemployed found work, Germans associated better times anew with the authoritarian government of the Nazis. In 1934, with help from Himmler, who was advancing in the police bureaucracy, Goering helped Hitler murder Röhm, the commander of the Nazi stormtroopers, to placate the German army, whose goodwill was essential to Nazi future plans. When I asked Goering how he felt about the murder of his friend Röhm, he said, well, he was in our way. After the death of Hindenburg, the non-executive president, in 1934, Hitler abolished the presidency, appointed himself head of state, and made the military and the civil servants, including the judiciary, swear loyalty to his own person, forbidden by the Constitution, which he ignored. And next, ignoring the cautions of his own senior generals, he marched 2 battalions of foot soldiers into the demilitarized Rhineland. France and England then, with 10 times his military power, merely twiddled their thumbs. Goebbels, who was Hitler's minister of propaganda, wrote in his diary, We wanted to acquire power legally, but we had no intention to use it legally once we had it. We set in the Reichstag, the German parliament, to arm ourselves with the weapons of democracy from its arsenal in order to destroy it. And Goebbels continued, our domestic foes never saw that our path of legality was just a trick, but they let us pass through the danger zone. And that's exactly how it was in foreign policy too. In 1933, a French prime minister ought to have said, and if I had been that French premier, I would have said it. The new Reich Chancellor Hitler is the man who wrote Mein Kampf. This man cannot be tolerated. Either he disappears or we march. But they left us alone. And we shall go down in history as the greatest statesman of all time or as the greatest criminals. That was in 1934. In September of 1935, the so-called Nuremberg Laws made clear that we Jews had to leave Germany, and multitudes then had no place to go, and they were marked for eventual extermination. As you heard, my family was fortunate to escape. Of Germany, after 1936, Robert Jackson said, the German people were in the hands of the police. The police were in the hands of the Nazi Party, which was run by a ring of evil men. After the annexation of Austria and the bloodless conquest of Czechoslovakia, in which he played decisive parts, Goering arranged to get rid of the conservative German generals, using trumped-up Gestapo charges to free Hitler to make his next moves. Actually, Goering was scheming to become Minister of War himself, which would have made him the most powerful man in Germany, and leave Hitler in a merely ceremonial, non-executive role. But Hitler instead appointed himself Commander-in-Chief of the Wehrmacht, the German armed forces, and thus preempted Goering swallowed his ambition, accepted a promotion, and Hitler named him his successor. And in the Nuremberg jail, Goering confessed to the prison psychiatrist Kelly that all along, and he said the same thing to me, I had a single driving ambition to achieve supreme command of the German Reich, and thus ended his first try at being number one in Germany. Before the invasion of Poland, Hitler had renounced the Versailles Treaty, regained the Tsar, acquired Austria and Czechoslovakia, and he had rearmed Germany, all without war. Germans were united to believe that they were on a pleasure cruise, when in fact they had boarded a Titanic. His foreign minister, Ribbentrop, had told him that he could take Poland, and England and France would just stand by. But they declared war on Germany. Hitler now abandoned any major personal involvement in non-military matters, which he left to Himmler, Goebbels, and others of the Nuremberg defendants, who vied in criminal acts they knew would please the Führer. Hitler personally directed the conquest of Western Europe and was accepted as a military genius. As he reveled in being commander-in-chief, he never again had a cabinet meeting, and the Supreme War Council, of which Goering was president, never met. He addressed the German nation only once, after 1940. Goering's Luftwaffe ruled the skies. Himmler, the Gestapo chief, amassed new powers, and Goebbels trumpeted the military genius of Hitler, and eventually was put in charge of the home front and war effort. But a year later, in 1941, Goering, though he kept all his titles, was far reduced in influence after his Luftwaffe lost the Battle of Britain and played no decisive role in the invasion of Russia. Goering was still allowed then to attend meetings, but there is no record that he was any longer influential. It was then, at this moment, that Goering issued the order to institute the final solution of the Jewish question, the Holocaust. The final solution of the Jewish question was German bureaucraties for the Holocaust. And he issued that order to Heydrich, the principal subordinate of Himmler. We had Goering acknowledge his signed order at Nuremberg, but no one ever asked him how he came to issue it to a member of Himmler's staff. We were so anxious to establish that he'd done it that we forgot to ask him, was it by order of Hitler, or was it his own last attempt to assert himself as the number 2 man? No one knows, but his order was carried out after being ignored from mid-1941 till January 1942. No order other than Goering's order for the final solution of the Jewish question has ever been found. After his Air Force failed to relieve Stalingrad in 1943, Goering started taking drugs. He had lost all influence. But as Germany collapsed in 1945, Goering, still Hitler's official successor, tried to assume the impotent Führer's powers as the Soviets advanced on his Berlin bunker. As virtually his last act, Hitler ordered Goering to be executed, but Goering escaped. And thus ended Goering's second attempt to assume supreme power in Germany. Let me now jump ahead to 1945 and my contacts with Goering and other defendants and witnesses at Nuremberg. After improbable adventures as a lone teen in all 5 continents, I had reached America in 1941 and became a U.S. combat soldier in 1943. In 1945, the war was over, and there was no German state. The Allied Control Commission, the Allied Control Council, exercised all executive, legislative, legal functions of a sovereign government for the conquered country. There were no German parties, no German newspapers, no German radio. Nuremberg was then a maze of narrow, bumpy, twisting lanes between huge and craggy mountains of rubble. There was a stench of dead bodies, the acrid odor of burnt-out fires, and the reek of cordite. And when I tossed a cigarette butt from my Jeep, 3 women swooped down on it like gulls. Elsewhere, and it's hard to believe today, elsewhere, 50 million human beings lay dead. Russians, Jews, slave laborers from all over Europe, and also close to 10 million Germans. All of them were victims of Hitler. Goering, the number 2 man, had surrounded as though he was Napoleon on his way to Elba. Little did he anticipate that he would soon be on his way to jail in Nuremberg. There, I, an enlisted immigrant U.S. soldier, aged 22, with a 10th grade education, became the boss of 50 interpreters and aides for the American prosecution. We produced more than 10,000 pages of sworn pretrial testimony from defendants and witnesses for which the Commanding General of U.S. forces in Europe cited us. one of my first encounters was with Goering. I remembered him as Hitler's designated successor with the exalted rank of Reichsmarschall, six-star general, clad in a gold-braided uniform and sporting a diamond-studded baton and all. All had been taken from Goering as I spent hundreds of hours with him, interpreting pre-trial depositions under oath and occasionally interrogating him. And when I first met him, he had the reputation of intimidating interpreters. And for a minute I remembered the refugee from Nazism that I had been. Colonel John Holland Amon, my boss, the chief interrogator and famous prosecutor of Murder Incorporated, a gang of New York thugs who killed for pay, coached me to assert my authority. I was to address Goering as plain Herr, not as Reichsmarschall. I told him that I was the chief interpreter, and then I stopped him from correcting my translation by addressing him as Herr Goering, mispronouncing his name Goering with the German vernacular Goering, which means paltry or little nothing. When Goering promised not to interrupt me again, I agreed to pronounce his name correctly. Now everything was in German apple pie order. He was the chief defendant, Amon was the chief interrogator, and I was the chief interpreter. And soon he demanded that only I speak for him. Amon never telegraphed what he knew when he questioned Goering, who claimed that he never had any authority over concentration camps, until his brother Albert testified that Hermann Goering had repeatedly ordered the release of inmates befriended by Albert. Then Amon got him to deny that he had any responsibility for the Holocaust, until I shoved his own signed order to institute the final solution of the Jewish question, that Nazi official euphemism for extermination under Goering's nose. That was a big surprise to him and to me too. After calling it a scrap of paper, he finally acknowledged his signature. We, at that time, were so anxious to establish the authenticity of the order that we never asked him why he issued it. And neither did Justice Jackson in cross-examination. Was he told by Hitler to do it? Or was it his last desperate attempt to ingratiate himself? I could believe, knowing this man and having talked to him, that to him, the death of millions was a small price for him to pay to regain his prestige. Once when I talked with him, was only a guard present, an exploding demolition charge used in the reconstruction of the court building opened a crack in the wall to my right, his left, and I saw a look of undisguised triumph on Goering's face, and I understood. He was silently composing a newspaper headline. Reichsmarschall Goering, the German war hero, was today buried in the rubble of a collapsing courthouse while facing his Jewish accuser. When the crack finally stopped growing, I smiled and he didn't. He believed that in another 30 years, Germans would build a marble mausoleum for him. My body won't be in it, he said, but Napoleon's is not in his tomb either. Now let me talk very briefly about another defendant, Hans Frank. No relation to the Jewish family of Anne Frank. Before becoming the murderous governor of occupied Poland, he was the Nazis' top legal officer. In 1934, he said, previously, when we had a legal decision to make, we had to ask, what does the law say we should do? Now we only ask, what would the Führer want us to do? That, in essence, became the defense of the other accused. Has the rule of man ever been so well described? On October the 19th, 1945, I was one of a two-member team who served the indictments on the defendants, on all of them. It was then 7 years and 1 month since I had left Germany to save my life. And I thought that was some round trip. I read the indictment to each of them. Invisibly, with them, stood the ghosts of Hitler, Himmler, Goebbels, and Bormann, the main criminals, and behind them, millions upon millions of the dead for whom we now spoke. To each of the accused I read, you are charged with crimes against the peace, war crimes, conspiracy to commit aggression, crimes against humanity, genocide. And I remembered once more the stacks of corpses I had seen as a combat soldier in Dachau. These defendants had no blood on their hands, and we saw no reassuring signs of insanity. The guilt of most of these men was clear from documents with their signatures upon them. But except for Goering, they were all accessories, not principals, carrying out criminal orders. The apparent normality of these men was frightening, oh so frightening, because I wondered, would there ever be another gang like them, anywhere, anytime? Goering stood out among them. He was a man with a brain and no conscience, a jolly criminal who would order the death of millions of innocents to improve his standing with Hitler when his star was declining. During the trial, when he was on the witness stand, the strategy became clear. He bragged about his deeds as a Nazi who stressed his loyalty to Hitler and completely ignored the letter's order for his execution. All of this to present himself as a martyr, to be executed by the victors and to be hallowed by the defeated. During the trial, Goering made one last attempt to be the Führer of the defendants. He tried to convince the other defendants, to follow his example by talking to them during the luncheon recess. And then we made him eat alone. And thus ended his last ambition to be a German hero before he too committed suicide at Nuremberg. I want to spend just a few minutes to talk about an actual perpetrator of the crime of genocide who became a witness at Nuremberg. And this was Rudolf Fuchs Ferdinand Höss, the commandant of Auschwitz. He took umbrage when I asked him whether it was true that he had incinerated 3.5 million human beings. No, he said, that's not right. Only 2.5 million. The rest died of other causes at Auschwitz. Höss also told me that he once caught SS men stealing gold extracted from victims' teeth. When I asked him whether he had ever enriched himself from prisoners' possessions, he almost spat in my face. Für was halten Sie mich? What kind of a man do you think I am? Höss complained that he had repeatedly applied to Himmler, his boss, for combat duty because he hated his job at Auschwitz. On the 4th of October, 1943, in a speech given to SS group leaders, Himmler said, "I shall speak to you here with all frankness of a very serious matter. We shall never speak of it in public. I mean the Jews, the extermination of the Jewish race. This is a glorious page in our history that has never been written and shall never be written. We had the moral right. No, we had the duty to our people to destroy this people which wanted to destroy us." Hess was astonished when I told him that Himmler wept uncontrollably after he once saw Jewish women and children being killed. "I had to suffer with that every day," said Hess, who, unlike Goering, was just a link in the chain of evil. I never met anyone at Nuremberg, defendant or witness, who defended the tenets of Nazism. The crimes of those convicted were undeniable, and the defense lawyers, in essence, tried only to challenge the legitimacy of the trial. Robert Jackson, in his summation, said, "The future will never have to ask, what could the Nazis have said in their favor? History will know that whatever could be said, they were allowed to say." The defendants have been unanimous in shifting the blame on Hitler, Himmler, Goebbels, and Bormann. All of them are dead or missing. The history of Hitler's Third Reich teaches that Hitler should have stopped by Germans in 1933 and by England and France while they had the power to do so before millions died. The Nuremberg trial condemned 10 of the defendants to hang, 7 to prison, and exonerated 3. Goering joined the other Nazis in suicide. I wanted to be the servant of justice at Nuremberg, but we knew that Nuremberg was only a start. Now, 60 years later, the Nuremberg proceedings have been partially endorsed by the United Nations. But the United States still needs to support a permanent international criminal court so that tyrants and their cohorts will know that punishment for criminal deeds is certain. Nuremberg was a step in the right direction, but only a step. To honor the precepts of Robert Jackson and to live up to our own commitment to freedom and justice, we must accept world law as an indispensable development of history that does not tolerate crimes by tyrants and their cohorts. Thank you for joining me. Thank you very much.
At your placemat today was a picture of Justice Robert H. Jackson pinning a medal of commendation on Richard Sonnenfeldt for his work as the chief interpreter at Nuremberg trials, and hopefully if you had a chance to see that, take it home as a souvenir. I'm his agent if you want to autograph. Also, I probably should have also made a copy of this, but here's a picture I also have of Rudolf Hess, John Amen, and Richard Sonnenfeldt. So this is kind of unique. Think about, not many people can talk about the fact of having an opportunity to talk to the Goerings, the Hesses, those folks that you see with seemingly are black and white History Channel movies. Here's Richard Sonnenfeldt, history in and of itself. And Dick, we can't thank you enough for really setting the stage. And I also might add, for the Jackson Center, Dick has been a very close and dear friend to the Jackson Center. And last year at this time, Dick was gracious enough to share with the Jackson Center the depositions. So if you can think about the depositions where there's Richard Sonnenfeldt, there's Hess, there's Ribbentrop, there's Goering, what it was, the questions that were asked, all translated in English, and they're now all part of the Robert Jackson Center archive. So to Dick Sonnenfeldt, we say many, many thanks. And I'm going to pause on behalf of the Jackson Center to At this time, if Dick's up for it, we'll do a couple of questions from the audience and be happy to entertain that. Keep in mind, this guy, if you ever see the Nuremberg movie with Alec Baldwin, there's a scene where the British Ari Neve walks around and delivers the indictments. I mean, it's major part of the scene. Well, the guy that's to his right, that's not in the movie but should be in the movie, who did all the translating, is this guy right here, Richard Sonnenfeldt. So to help put that into some sort of historical perspective.
And if you see the German movie that just came out of the same thing, there I am, but not me, I'm impersonated as a good-looking 20-year-old soldier.
And I might add, good segue, that there are at least 6 documentaries in German, which Dick is a star over there. And this book, which was issued, was it 2 years ago, Dick?
Yes.
It's a bestseller in Germany. In fact, Christoph Safferling, and this whole web that we weave here tonight, was at an event at the courtroom at Nuremberg, courtroom 600, where Dick unveiled this to a huge throng, and Christoph Safferling was in the front row to hear it, and of course he could understand it because it was in German. But we talked a little bit tonight about that event, which Barbara unfortunately had to listen to it in German and was sitting in the back and really probably didn't have a clue what he was talking about. So, any questions here? Any questions of
this? Speer stood up, and after he went over his career, he started out as Hitler's architect. There was nothing criminal in being Hitler's architect. As you know, he was appointed as Minister of Munitions. And he then said several things that were very interesting. The first thing he said was that as a member of a Nazi government, he had to accept responsibility as a member of that government, but he never accepted personal responsibility for using and killing slave labor. And he then went on to lecture the court about the dangers of weapons of mass destruction. He went into a lengthy explanation of how you could push a button and send a rocket from Peenemünde or from Frankfurt to New York with an atom bomb in it later, or with bombs in it, and cause terrible havoc. And my impression was that the judges, and Justice Jackson in particular, who cross-examined him, were so delighted to finally have a defendant who indicted the Nazi regime. He said the Nazis were not only to be hated, they were to be feared. That the Führer principle, the principle of one man making all the decisions, was one of the most stupid things you could ever think of. They were so delighted to have somebody indict the Nazis as an institution that they never pressed him in cross-examination to find out what his involvement really was. The man who delivered the slave labor to him, Sauckel, was condemned to death and was hanged. And in my opinion, Speer was just as guilty, but his defense was much cleverer in that he indicted the Nazi system. And I think he completely bamboozled the judges and prosecutors. And if you look at the Brûleur film, which is one of the latest films on Speer, that comes out pretty well. But it's a mystery. The man was a mystery. I must say another thing about Speer. When you listened to him, you had the feeling that you were listening to somebody who had an out-of-body experience, as though he was talking about somebody else, not himself. But he was a very clever man in defending himself and had a very good attorney. And the evidence indicates that it was well planned.
Why they have not? What's your impression?
Well, my impression is very simply that the administration changed from Democratic to Republican. That was the act that caused it. I think there was an unreasoning fear what could happen to American servicemen who were captured by an outlaw regime, that they could be hauled up before a kangaroo court. And my attitude about that is, if they were captured by an outlaw regime, they would be hauled up before a kangaroo court anyway. And I thought it was far more important for the United States, I've said it before, for the United States to vote for an international criminal court than to deny it. And my hope is that someday we'll have a change of administration, a change of heart, and vote for an international criminal court that makes crimes like those committed at Nuremberg and those committed by Milosevic and Rwanda international crimes. Robert Jackson said something that to me, at least, was terribly impressive. He says, the time has come that we punish statesmen who have big official jobs for the same crimes for which we punish every little man.
With that, we ought to conclude. That was pretty profound, Dick. So thank you, everyone, for coming tonight, and we look forward to tomorrow morning. Thank you.